The cold October wind whistled through the dusty streets of Willow Creek, Montana, as Virginia Clarke stepped off the stagecoach with trembling legs and a bundle clutched protectively to her chest. Her journey from Boston had been long and fraught with anxiety, but nothing could have prepared her for the sinking feeling in her stomach as she scanned the faces of those waiting at the station, searching for the man she was meant to marry. The year was 1878, and at 22 years old, Virginia had traded the only life she'd ever known for the promise of marriage to a man she'd never met. The letters they'd exchanged over 6 months had painted him as kind and steady a cattle rancher named Thomas Blackwood, who sought a wife to share his life on the frontier. She had responded to his advertisement in the newspaper with hope in her heart, desperate to escape the scandal that had engulfed her in Boston. The bundle in her arms stirred, and Virginia adjusted her hold, pulling back the blanket slightly to check on her 4-month-old son. James blinked up at her with his bright blue eyes, mercifully quiet after the final leg of their journey. She hadn't mentioned him in her letters to Thomas. She couldn't bring herself to confess that she was already a mother, afraid he would reject her correspondence immediately. Virginia had planned to explain everything upon arrival, hoping that once he met her, he might find it in his heart to accept them both. "Miss Clarke," a stern voice broke through her thoughts. Virginia turned to see a tall man with graying hair and a neatly trimmed beard. His expression was cold, his posture rigid as he removed his hat. "Mr. Blackwood?" she asked, forcing a smile despite the knot forming in her stomach. "Indeed." His gaze dropped to the bundle in her arms and his face hardened. "You failed to mention certain circumstances in your letters." Virginia's heart raced as she clutched James closer. "I can explain, Mr. Blackwood." There is nothing to explain," he cut her off, his voice low enough that the other passengers wouldn't hear. "I sought a wife, not someone else's burden. I'm afraid our arrangement cannot proceed." The blood drained from Virginia's face. "Please, Mr. Blackwood, we've come so far. James is a good baby and I'm a hard worker. I'm sorry, Miss Clarke, but my decision is final." He placed his hat back on his head and reached into his pocket, pulling out a few bills. "This should secure you lodging for tonight and passage back east tomorrow. Good day." Virginia stared at the money, too shocked to take it. "But I have nowhere to go. I cannot return to Boston." Thomas Blackwood's expression flickered with momentary guilt before hardening once more. He placed the money on top of her small trunk that had been unloaded from the stagecoach. "That is unfortunate, but it is not my concern. The hotel is down the street." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Virginia standing alone with her baby and a single trunk containing everything she owned. Tears stung her eyes as panic rose in her chest. James began to fuss, sensing his mother's distress. The stagecoach driver had already moved on to unloading mail, and the other passengers had dispersed, leaving her alone on the wooden platform as the afternoon sun began its descent. "Looks like you've been left high and dry, madam." Virginia turned to find a young woman watching her with sympathetic eyes. She wore a practical dress with an apron, her red hair tucked beneath a simple bonnet. "I'm Martha, I work at the general store," she nodded toward the baby. "That's what scared him off, I reckon." Virginia nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Martha sighed. "Thomas Blackwood's a decent enough rancher, but he's got some rigid ideas about propriety. Listen, the boarding house where I stay might take you in for a night or two until you figure things out. Mrs. Peterson's fair-minded." "Thank you," Virginia managed, reaching for the money Thomas had left. Her hands shook as she picked up the bills, noticing it was barely enough for 2 nights' lodging and certainly not enough for passage back east, not that she had any intention of returning. "Here, let me help with your trunk." A deep voice came from behind her, and Virginia turned to see a tall man approaching. His dark blonde hair was partially hidden beneath a worn cowboy hat, and his face was tanned from long days in the sun. Unlike Thomas Blackwood's fine suit, this man wore practical work clothes, a faded blue shirt, sturdy trousers, and scuffed boots. "I don't mean to intrude, madam, but it looked like you could use a hand." His voice was gentle, contrasting with his rugged appearance. His eyes were a warm hazel as they met hers, then shifted to the baby in her arms. Unlike Thomas, his expression remained kind. "Thank you, Mr. Yates, Yeager Yates." The corner of his mouth turned up slightly. "I know it's an unusual name. My mother had a fondness for peculiar names." Despite everything, Virginia felt a small smile tug at her lips. "Virginia Clarke, and this is James." Yeager nodded at the baby. "Pleasure to meet you both." He lifted her trunk with ease. "Where are we headed?" Martha stepped forward. "The boarding house on Elm Street." "I was just telling Miss Clarke about Mrs. Peterson taking in boarders." Yeager's expression grew serious. "Martha, Mrs. Peterson's house is full up. The Wallace family from Idaho arrived yesterday, all 7 of them crammed into 2 rooms while they're waiting for their homestead papers." Martha's face fell. "Oh dear, I hadn't heard." Virginia felt the brief flicker of hope extinguish inside her. James began to cry in earnest now, his tiny face reddening with the effort. She tried to soothe him, but her own mounting panic made it difficult. "He's probably hungry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I need somewhere to feed him and rest." Yeager studied her for a moment, his expression thoughtful, then he nodded as if coming to a decision. "Miss Clarke, I have a proposition for you. I own the Double Y Ranch about 3 miles outside of town. It's nothing fancy, but I've got a small cabin on the property that my ranch hand used before he moved on to California last month. It's clean and private. You're welcome to stay there while you figure out your next steps." Virginia stared at him, searching for any sign of impropriety in his offer, but his eyes remained respectful, his posture non-threatening. Martha spoke up. "Yeager Yates is good people, Miss Clarke. Known him since he first came to these parts 8 years ago. If he's offering you shelter, you can trust his word." "I wouldn't presume to put you out, Mr. Yates," Virginia said, though she had precious few options. "It's no trouble. The cabin's just sitting empty and—" He looked at James, whose cries had softened to whimpers. "No child should be without a roof over his head, especially with winter coming on." The kindness in his voice nearly broke her composure. "Thank you, Mr. Yates. I accept your offer, at least for tonight." Yeager nodded. "My wagon's just over there. If you're ready, we can head out now. We'll make it before dark." As they walked toward his wagon, Virginia felt both relief and trepidation. She was putting her trust in a stranger, something she'd promised herself she'd never do again after what had happened in Boston. But as Yeager Yates carefully placed her trunk in the back of his wagon and then offered his hand to help her up to the seat, something told her this man was different. The journey to the Double Y Ranch passed mostly in silence. Virginia fed James beneath a light blanket for privacy, and Yeager kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead, giving her the space she needed. The Montana landscape stretched out around them, rolling hills covered in autumn gold grasses, stands of aspen trees with their leaves turning bright yellow against the darkening sky, and in the distance, mountains touched with early snow. "It's beautiful here," Virginia said softly, breaking the silence. Yeager nodded. "That it is, different from where you're from, I expect. Boston is." She paused, searching for words that wouldn't reveal too much. "It's crowded and loud. There's always someone watching, judging." "Not much judging out here," Yeager said. "Most folks are too busy trying to survive to worry about other people's business." He glanced at her. "Though I reckon Thomas Blackwood proved that's not always true." Virginia looked down at James, now sleeping peacefully in her arms. "He had expectations for a wife. I failed to meet them before I even arrived." Yeager's hands tightened slightly on the reins. "A man who'd reject a woman and her child without even hearing her story isn't worth fretting over, Miss Clarke." They crested a small hill, and Virginia gasped softly. Below them lay the Double Y Ranch, a modest but well-maintained house with a broad porch, several outbuildings, a corral with horses, and a barn. Smoke curled from the chimney, and lantern light glowed in the windows, making it look welcoming against the approaching twilight. "It's not much," Yeager said, a hint of pride in his voice despite his humble words. "Built most of it with my own hands." "It's lovely," Virginia said sincerely. As they pulled up to the house, the front door opened and an older woman stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "You're late for supper, Yeager," she called, then stopped when she noticed Virginia and the baby. "Mrs. Winters, this is Miss Virginia Clarke and her son James," Yeager said as he set the brake on the wagon. They'll be staying in the old cabin for a spell. Miss Clarke, this is Mrs. Dorothy Winters, my housekeeper and the best cook in the territory. Mrs. Winters' eyebrows rose, but to her credit, she simply nodded. Well, you're just in time for beef stew and fresh bread. I'll set another place while Yeager shows you to the cabin. Yeager helped Virginia down from the wagon, then retrieved her trunk. The cabin's just over there, he said, nodding toward a small structure about 50 yards from the main house. As they walked, Virginia said, Mrs. Winters seems surprised by our arrival. Yeager chuckled. Dorothy's been with me for 6 years. She's not used to me bringing home strays, human ones at least. I've got a habit of adopting the occasional orphaned calf or injured foal. When they reached the cabin, Yeager shifted the trunk to one arm and opened the door. Inside was a simple but tidy space, a small stove in one corner, a narrow bed with a clean mattress, a table with 2 chairs, and a rocking chair near the stove. There was a small shelf with a few books, a washstand with a basin and pitcher, and a trunk at the foot of the bed. Like I said, it's nothing fancy, Yeager said, setting her trunk down, but it's warm and dry. It's perfect, Virginia replied, truly grateful. After the long journey and the devastating rejection earlier, this simple shelter felt like a palace. Yeager lit the lamp on the table and moved to the stove. I'll get a fire going for you. There's wood stacked outside the door. The outhouse is just behind, and there's a pump for water nearby. He paused. Do you have everything you need for the little one? Virginia nodded. For now, yes. I brought what I could carry. As Yeager built the fire, Virginia took the opportunity to change James and settle him on the bed, surrounding him with pillows so he wouldn't roll off. By the time she finished, the stove was radiating welcome heat. Supper will be ready soon, Yeager said, standing and dusting off his hands. You're welcome to join us at the house, or I can bring a tray out here if you'd prefer. Virginia hesitated. The thought of facing Mrs. Winters' curious eyes was daunting, but she also didn't want to appear ungrateful. I'd like to join you if that's all right. James should sleep for a while now. Yeager nodded. Good. We can bring him along. Dorothy has a basket we used for kittens last spring that might work as a makeshift cradle. Virginia was touched by his thoughtfulness. As they walked back to the main house with James nestled in her arms, she couldn't help but compare Yeager's kindness to Thomas Blackwood's cold rejection. Both men were strangers to her, yet one had shown her more compassion in an hour than the other had in months of correspondence. Inside, the house was warm and smelled of savory stew and fresh bread. The main room was comfortably furnished with a sofa, several chairs, a large hearth, and bookshelves filled with volumes. Through a doorway, Virginia could see a dining table set for 3. Mrs. Winters emerged from what must have been the kitchen, carrying a tureen of stew. She eyed Virginia and James with undisguised curiosity, but maintained a polite demeanor. There's a basket in the pantry that might suit the little one, she said, setting the tureen on the table. I'll fetch it. Over supper, Virginia answered Mrs. Winters' carefully phrased questions about her journey from Boston, sharing only that her arrangement with Thomas Blackwood had fallen through upon her arrival. If the housekeeper suspected there was more to the story, she didn't press. Yeager spoke mostly of the ranch, the cattle he was raising, his plans for expanding his small apple orchard, and the challenges of the upcoming winter. It was clear he loved his land and took pride in what he'd built. How long have you been in Montana? Virginia asked as Mrs. Winters served apple pie for dessert, came out in '70 after the war, Yeager replied. Spent some time working other men's ranches, saved every penny, then bought this place when it was nothing but a run-down shack and overgrazed pasture. You fought in the war? Virginia asked. A shadow crossed his face. Union cavalry, enlisted in '63 when I was 18. He didn't elaborate, and Virginia didn't press. After supper, when James began to fuss, Mrs. Winters surprised Virginia by asking to hold him while Virginia finished her tea. The older woman cradled him with practiced ease. Had 4 of my own, she explained, seeing Virginia's expression. All grown now, scattered across the country. My youngest, Elizabeth, is about your age, lives in Oregon with her husband and 2 little ones. As Virginia prepared to return to the cabin with James, Yeager handed her a lantern. I'll be up at first light to check on the herd, but Dorothy will be around if you need anything. Help yourself to whatever's in the kitchen. Thank you, Mr. Yates, for everything. He tipped his hat slightly. Yeager, please, and you're welcome, Miss Clarke. Virginia, she offered in return. That night, as she lay in the narrow bed with James nestled beside her, Virginia stared at the cabin's ceiling and allowed herself, for the first time since arriving in Montana, to truly feel the weight of her situation. She had no husband, little money, and no prospects in this unfamiliar place. Yet somehow she had found shelter and kindness when she most needed it. Tomorrow, she would need to think about what came next. But for tonight, she was safe, her son was fed and warm, and that was enough. The following morning, Virginia woke to the sound of activity outside. Sunlight streamed through the small window, and James was still sleeping peacefully beside her. She dressed quickly and stepped outside to find Yeager leading a saddled horse toward the main house. He spotted her and changed direction. "Morning," he called. "Sleep well." "Yes, thank you," she replied, adjusting her shawl against the morning chill. "Is there somewhere I could wash clothes? James and I are running low on clean things." "Of course. Dorothy does laundry on Mondays, that's today, so her tubs will be set up behind the house. She'll show you." Virginia nodded, then gathered her courage. "Mr. Yates Yeager, I appreciate your kindness, but I can't impose on you indefinitely. I need to find work and a more permanent situation." Yeager tied his horse to a post and approached. "No rush on that account. Winter's coming on fast up here and jobs are scarce this time of year." He hesitated, then added, "Actually, I might have a proposition for you if you're interested." "A proposition?" Dorothy's been talking about visiting her daughter in Oregon for months. With winter approaching, this would be her last chance until spring. "I've been putting her off because I can't manage the house and the ranch on my own." He gestured toward the cabin. "If you'd be willing to take over some of Dorothy's duties, cooking, cleaning, that sort of thing, you and James could stay on. I'd pay you a fair wage, of course." Virginia's mind raced. It wasn't the future she'd imagined, but it would give her time to establish herself in this new place, save some money, and care for James in a safe environment. "I'm a decent cook," she said cautiously, "and I know how to keep a house." Yeager smiled. "I'm not looking for fancy Boston cooking, just regular meals and a clean shirt now and then. And James, he'll need attention during the day. Bring him along wherever you go. I'm not expecting miracles, Virginia. Just help keeping things running while Dorothy's away." Virginia nodded slowly. "When would she leave?" "End of the week, if you're agreeable. She'd be gone through Christmas, likely returning in January when the pass is clear." "Then yes, I accept your offer. Thank you." Yeager's smile widened. "Good, I'll tell Dorothy at breakfast. Speaking of which, there's coffee on the stove whenever you're ready." As he mounted his horse and rode toward the pastures, Virginia watched him go, a strange mix of relief and uncertainty swirling within her. She was grateful for the opportunity, but cautious about becoming dependent on another's charity. Yet something about Yeager Yates inspired trust, a quality she'd found sorely lacking in men since James's father had abandoned her upon learning of her pregnancy. The week passed quickly as Dorothy showed Virginia the routines of the household where supplies were kept, how Yeager liked his shirts pressed, which days were best for baking bread. The older woman was thorough and patient, answering Virginia's questions without prying too deeply into her past. On Friday morning, Yeager drove Dorothy to town to catch the stagecoach west. Virginia stood on the porch with James, waving goodbye, suddenly aware of the responsibility she'd taken on. She would be alone with Yeager Yates, a man she barely knew, for the next several months. Yet as the days passed, Virginia found herself settling into a comfortable routine. She rose early to prepare breakfast before Yeager went out to work with his small crew of ranch hands. She cleaned, baked, mended, and cared for James, who seemed to thrive in the fresh mountain air. In the evenings, she and Yeager would share supper, talking about their days or sometimes just enjoying companionable silence. Yeager was unfailingly kind both to her and to James. He carved a small wooden horse for the baby, brought Virginia wildflowers he found while checking fence lines, and never questioned her about the circumstances that had brought her west. His respect for her privacy only made Virginia trust him more. As October gave way to November, the weather turned sharply colder. Snow dusted the mountain peaks, and frost covered the ground each morning. Virginia found herself watching for Yeager's return each evening with increasing anticipation, enjoying their conversations by the fire after James was asleep. One evening in mid-November, as a snowstorm howled outside, Virginia sat mending one of Yeager's shirts while he whittled by the fire. James was asleep in the basket Mrs. Winters had indeed converted into a cradle, now lined with soft flannel. "May I ask you something personal?" Yeager said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. Virginia's hands stilled. "You may ask, I might not answer," he smiled slightly. "Fair enough." He set aside his whittling and looked at her directly. "Why did you come west as a mail-order bride? You're educated, well-spoken, clearly from a good family. You could have had your pick of suitors in Boston." Virginia set down her mending, considering how much to reveal. "You've been kind not to pry, and I appreciate that. The truth is complicated. Most truths are," Yeager said quietly. Virginia took a deep breath. "I was engaged to be married to a man from a prominent Boston family, James Harrington Clarke. When I told him I was expecting his child, he denied paternity and broke our engagement." The words felt strange to say aloud after keeping them buried for so long. His family had influence. They spread rumors that I had been indiscreet with multiple men. No one would believe my word against theirs. Yeager's expression darkened. "The coward. My parents stood by me, but the scandal was too much for my father's business. He lost clients' contracts. They were forced to sell our home and move to my aunt's house in Rhode Island." Virginia blinked back tears. "I couldn't be the cause of further hardship for them. When I saw Thomas Blackwood's advertisement, it seemed like a chance to start fresh somewhere no one knew me." "And you named your son after his father, despite everything?" Yeager asked, his voice gentle. Virginia gave a bitter laugh. "No, I named him James after my grandfather, the kindest man I ever knew. I wanted my son to have a name he could be proud of, not one that would remind me of betrayal." Yeager nodded slowly. "Thank you for trusting me with your story. Now I've answered your question, may I ask one of my own? Seems only fair." Virginia hesitated, then asked, "Why haven't you married? You're established, kind, certainly not unattractive." She felt heat rise to her cheeks at the admission. Yeager looked into the fire. "I was engaged once before the war. Her name was Sarah. We planned to marry when I returned." His voice grew softer. "She died of typhoid while I was fighting at Petersburg. By the time her letter reached me, she'd been gone 3 months. "I'm so sorry," Virginia whispered. He shrugged, though the gesture couldn't hide the old pain in his eyes. "After the war, I couldn't stay in Kentucky. Too many memories. I came west to start over, build something with my own hands." He looked up at her. "Never met anyone who made me want to try again, until recently, perhaps." The look he gave her sent warmth spreading through Virginia's chest. She quickly picked up her mending again, unsure how to respond to the unspoken sentiment in his words. "It's getting late," she said finally. "I should put James to bed properly." Yeager nodded, returning to his whittling. "Good night, Virginia." "Good night, Yeager." As November progressed into December, the ranch settled into its winter rhythm. The cattle were brought in closer to the barns, and Yeager spent long hours ensuring they had enough feed to last until spring. Virginia decorated the house with pine boughs and berries for Christmas, determined to make the holiday special despite their modest circumstances. James grew stronger each day, now able to hold his head up and reaching for objects with increasing coordination. Virginia often found Yeager talking to the baby in the evenings, holding him carefully in his large, calloused hands and telling him stories about the ranch and the animals. "He likes your voice," Virginia remarked one evening as James cooed happily while Yeager described a mountain lion he'd spotted that morning. "Smart boy," Yeager replied with a wink that made Virginia's heart skip. "Takes after his mama." Such moments were becoming more frequent, small compliments, lingering glances, a hand brushing hers as they passed dishes at supper. Virginia told herself not to read too much into these gestures. Yeager was kind to everyone, it was his nature. Yet she couldn't deny the flutter in her stomach when he smiled at her, or the way she found herself watching him as he worked around the ranch. 3 days before Christmas, Virginia woke to find heavy snow falling, the landscape transformed into a pristine white expanse. Yeager had gone out before dawn to check on the cattle, promising to return by midday. As morning stretched into afternoon with no sign of him, Virginia began to worry. Just as she was considering asking one of the ranch hands to search for him, the door burst open and Yeager stomped in, covered in snow but grinning broadly. "Sorry I'm late," he said, shaking snow from his coat. "Got sidetracked." "I was beginning to worry," Virginia admitted, taking his coat to hang by the fire. "No need for that. Just had to make a small detour into town." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper. Early Christmas present for James. Virginia unwrapped it to find a tiny pair of soft leather moccasins, beautifully made with beaded decoration. "They're made by a Crow woman who sells her work in town," Yeager explained. "Thought he might need proper boots now that he's growing so fast." "They're beautiful," Virginia said, deeply touched. "Thank you. That's not all." Yeager reached into his pocket and pulled out another small package. "This one's for you." Inside was a silver brooch shaped like a wild rose, simple but elegantly crafted. "Yeager, it's lovely, but you shouldn't have. I wanted to," he said simply. "You deserve pretty things, Virginia." Their eyes met, and something in his gaze made Virginia's breath catch. Before she could respond, James began to cry from his cradle in the corner, breaking the moment. As she picked up her son, Virginia caught Yeager watching them with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, tenderness mixed with something that looked almost like longing. Christmas Day dawned clear and cold, the world outside the windows a dazzling white. Virginia had spent the previous evening preparing a special dinner: a roast chicken, potatoes, carrots from the root cellar, and an apple pie. She'd also made small gifts, a knitted scarf for Yeager and new shirts for the two ranch hands who would join them for dinner. After a simple breakfast, Yeager disappeared outside, returning an hour later with a small pine tree. "Thought we could use some Christmas cheer," he said, setting it up in a corner of the main room. Together, they decorated it with strings of dried berries, pine cones, and small wooden ornaments Yeager had carved. Virginia found herself laughing as they worked, realizing it was the happiest Christmas she'd had in years. When the ranch hands arrived for dinner, bringing a jug of cider and stories from their own Christmas mornings, the house filled with warmth and laughter. James was passed from arm to arm, cooing at the attention and showing off his new teeth with gummy smiles. "You've done wonders with this place, Miss Clarke," said Henry, the older of the two hands. "Hasn't seen this much life in all the years I've worked here." "It's just missing one thing to make it a proper home," added Frank, the younger hand, with a meaningful glance at Yeager that made Virginia blush. After dinner, when the hands had returned to their bunkhouse and James was asleep, Virginia and Yeager sat by the fire with cups of cider. "Thank you for today," she said softly. "It's been wonderful." Yeager looked at her, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. "Having you and James here, it's changed things, changed me." Virginia's heart quickened. "How so? This place was just land and buildings before. Now it feels like a home." He set down his cup and leaned forward. "Virginia, I know you came here looking for something different, but I was hoping. That is, I wondered if you might consider staying, not as my housekeeper, but as—" "As what?" she whispered, hardly daring to hope what he might be suggesting. "As my wife." The words came out in a rush. "I know it's sudden and you have every reason to be cautious after what you've been through, but these past months, watching you with James, seeing your strength and kindness, I've fallen in love with you, Virginia, with both of you." Virginia stared at him, speechless. Of all the ways she'd imagined her life unfolding when she'd first stepped off that stagecoach, this hadn't been among them. "I don't expect an answer right away," Yeager continued when she remained silent. "Just think about it. I promise I'd be a good husband to you and a father to James. I already love him as if he were my own." Tears filled Virginia's eyes. "Yeager, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll think about it," he said gently. "That's all I ask for now." Virginia nodded, her mind whirling with emotions: hope, fear, and something else she'd been afraid to acknowledge. Love, that night, as she lay in bed with James sleeping peacefully beside her, Virginia thought about Yeager's proposal. She'd come to Montana seeking security, a fresh start away from scandal. What Yeager offered was so much more a true partnership, a father for her son, and love she hadn't dared hope for again. Was she ready to trust her heart to another man? Yeager was nothing like James Clarke. He was honest, hardworking, and had shown nothing but respect for her from the moment they'd met. He'd accepted her son without hesitation, even loved him. And somewhere along the way, amid the daily routines of ranch life, Virginia had fallen in love with him too. The realization washed over her with surprising clarity. She loved Yeager Yates, his quiet strength, his kindness, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, how gently he held James, how hard he worked to build something meaningful on this wild land. The next morning, Virginia rose early, her decision made. She found Yeager in the barn, checking on a mare about to foal. "Yeager," she called softly. He turned, his face lighting up when he saw her. "Virginia, good morning." She took a deep breath. "I've been thinking about what you asked yesterday." His expression grew serious. "And?" "My answer is yes." The words came easily now that she'd made her decision. "I would be honored to be your wife." For a moment, Yeager stood perfectly still. Then he crossed the barn in 3 long strides and gathered her in his arms, lifting her off her feet in a joyful embrace. "You've made me the happiest man in Montana territory," he whispered against her hair. When he set her down, Virginia looked up into his face. "There's something else, James. I want him to have your name, to truly be your son in every way that matters." Emotion filled Yeager's eyes. "Nothing would make me prouder than to call him my son." Their first kiss was gentle, a promise of the life they would build together. As Yeager's lips met hers, Virginia felt the last of her fears melting away. This was where she belonged, not with a stranger from a newspaper advertisement, but with a man whose heart she'd come to know and trust. They were married 2 weeks later in the town church, with Martha from the general store as witness and James cooing in the arms of Henry's wife. The ceremony was simple, but as Virginia spoke her vows, she knew she'd found something far greater than the security she'd originally sought. She'd found love, acceptance, and a true home. Spring came early that year, bringing with it new life across the ranch. Calves frolicked in the greening pastures, wildflowers dotted the hillsides, and James took his first steps, tottering across the porch with determination while Yeager and Virginia watched with pride. On a warm afternoon in May, as Virginia hung laundry in the yard with James playing nearby, she spotted Yeager riding toward the house, returning early from checking the north pasture. Something in the way he rode straight-backed and purposeful made her pause. He dismounted quickly and strode toward her, his expression unreadable. "Yeager, is something wrong?" Instead of answering, he pulled a letter from his pocket. "This came for you." Sheriff was holding it at the post office. Virginia took the envelope with trembling hands, recognizing her mother's handwriting. She'd written to her parents after the wedding, giving them her new name and address, but hadn't received a reply until now. Opening it carefully, she read the brief message inside, her eyes filling with tears. "What is it?" Yeager asked, concern evident in his voice. "My father. He's been ill. They want to visit us this summer." She looked up at him. "They want to meet their grandson, and you." Yeager smiled, relief replacing concern. "We'll make up the spare room. When do they arrive?" "July, if the weather holds." Virginia pressed the letter to her chest. "I've missed them so much." "Then we'd better start preparing. Maybe add on that extra bedroom I've been talking about. Give your parents some privacy." Yeager picked up James, who had toddled over and was tugging at his pants leg. "What do you think, son? Ready to meet your grandparents?" James responded with a happy babble, reaching for Yeager's hat. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple, Virginia leaned against Yeager's shoulder, James sleeping in her lap. "I never thought I'd find this," she said softly. "When I stepped off that stagecoach and saw Thomas Blackwood's face, I thought my life was over before it had begun." Yeager's arm tightened around her shoulders. "The moment I saw you standing there with James, I knew my life was about to change, just didn't know how much. Do you ever regret it?" "Taking in a stranger with a baby." He turned to look at her, his expression serious. "Virginia Yates, not for one single moment. The day you came into my life was the luckiest day I've ever known." As the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared, Virginia reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From the scandal in Boston to the rejection in Willow Creek, every step painful as some had been had led her to this moment, this man, this life. She had arrived in Montana seeking merely a safe harbor from the storms of her past. Instead, she had found a love strong enough to weather any challenge, a father for her son who loved him unconditionally, and a home where they both truly belonged. As if reading her thoughts, Yeager leaned down and kissed her gently. "Welcome home, Virginia," he whispered against her lips. "Welcome home." The summer brought long, sunny days and the arrival of Virginia's parents. Their reunion was tearful and joyous, with her mother instantly smitten with James and her father taking an immediate liking to Yeager. They stayed for a month, helping with the garden, joining in community gatherings, and gradually healing the wounds that had separated them. On their last evening together, Virginia's father took Yeager aside while the women prepared supper. "I want to thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for loving my daughter when others turned their backs, for giving my grandson a name and a future." Yeager shook his head. "No need for thanks. They're the ones who gave my life meaning." Fall came again, painting the landscape in brilliant colors. On the anniversary of Virginia's arrival in Montana, Yeager surprised her with a small gold locket containing a tiny photograph of James. "To remember how our story began," he said as he fastened it around her neck, "with a brave woman and her precious son stepping off a stagecoach and into my heart." Virginia touched the locket, then placed her hand over her stomach with a secret smile. "Perhaps it's time to add another chapter to our story." Yeager's eyes widened. "Virginia, are you?" She nodded, her eyes shining. "Come spring, James will have a little brother or sister." Yeager whooped with joy, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around as James clapped his hands and giggled at his parents' happiness. That night, as they lay together in the quiet darkness, Yeager placed his hand gently over Virginia's still flat stomach. "When I was a boy," he said softly, "my grandfather told me that the best things in life come unexpected. I never understood what he meant until I saw you standing alone at that stagecoach stop." Virginia covered his hand with her own. "I came west seeking a husband and found so much more: a partner, a friend, a father for my children, and a love I never thought possible." Outside their window, a shooting star streaked across the Montana sky, a fleeting moment of brilliance in the vast darkness. Like that star, Virginia's journey had been one of chance and timing the right person in the right place at the right moment. "I love you, Yeager Yates," she whispered. "And I love you, Virginia Yates," he replied, "now and always." As they drifted to sleep in each other's arms, Virginia knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges life might bring, they would face them together: the mail-order bride who had been rejected, the child who needed a father, and the cowboy who had opened his heart and said, "I'll raise him as mine." Their story, born of rejection and chance, had become one of love, family, and belonging, a testament to the healing power of acceptance and the unexpected joy that can arise from life's most difficult moments. The Double Y Ranch flourished through the years, growing along with their family. The following spring brought a daughter they named Sarah Dorothy, after Yeager's lost love and the housekeeper who had become like family. 2 years later, a son they called William joined the family, completing their circle of love. James grew tall and strong under Yeager's guidance, learning to ride almost before he could walk, developing his father's keen eye for good cattle and his mother's compassionate heart. He never questioned his place in the family, secure in the knowledge that he was loved beyond measure by both his parents. Virginia's parents eventually sold their Rhode Island home and built a small cottage on the ranch property, bringing their skills and wisdom to the growing enterprise. Virginia's father, a former merchant, helped Yeager expand the ranch's operations, while her mother taught the children to read and write before they were old enough for the local school. Through it all, the harsh winters, summer droughts, difficult births, and everyday challenges of frontier life, Virginia and Yeager's love remained steadfast, growing deeper with each passing year. The letters from Thomas Blackwood, which eventually came seeking forgiveness, went unanswered. The past was behind them, Their future stretched before them like the endless Montana sky. On James's 18th birthday, Yeager took him to the highest point on the ranch property, where they could see for miles in every direction. "Son," he said, his arm around the young man's shoulders, "your mother came west seeking a different life than the one she found. Sometimes the best things happen when our plans fall apart." James nodded, understanding in his eyes. "She found you instead." "No," Yeager corrected gently. "We found each other, and in doing so, we both found the family we were meant to have." He gestured toward the sprawling ranch below them. "One day this will all be yours and your brother's to share, but the most valuable thing I can leave you isn't land or cattle." "What is it, Pa?" Yeager smiled at the young man who had his mother's eyes and intelligence, but who had grown to mirror Yeager's own stance and values. "The knowledge that family isn't always about blood. It's about who loves you enough to stand beside you when the world turns its back. Remember that, James. It's the most important lesson I can teach you." As they rode back to the house where Virginia waited with fresh pie and coffee, James looked at the man who had chosen to be his father and made a silent promise to live by those words, to always recognize the extraordinary value of chosen family and unconditional love. And Virginia, watching her husband and eldest son return home together, felt her heart swell with gratitude for the unexpected journey that had brought her to this place, this man, this life. The stagecoach that had carried her west had delivered her not to rejection and despair, but to the very destiny she was meant to find in the arms of a cowboy with a heart big enough to love another man's child as his own.